When I first started taking composing seriously, I didn't know the difference between a notation software like Sibelius or Finale, RIP, and a digital audio workstation like Logic or Cubase. When I was in school, they really focused on that more traditional style of writing, notation, writing for a live player, learning more about the orchestra, and thinking more in terms of sheet music. But when I realized that I had a passion for writing to picture and media scoring, I actually had a friend introduce me to Logic. And I remember being so overwhelmed by having to learn something new. I thought I could just get great sounding music out of Sibelius. I didn't realize that mockups were typically done in an actual DAW, like Logic or Cubase. And because I was so used to using Sibelius as my way of writing music, I would write out the entire piece in a notation software and then transfer the MIDI over into my DAW, which doubled the writing time. It also made me feel a lot less creative. What I didn't understand was that mockup writing is a completely different skill. It's not just knowing how to orchestrate, knowing the different instruments you're using, but knowing how to apply that knowledge into this new tool, this DAW, right? Using your sample libraries. So I started to look back and really reflect on a lot of the mistakes I made, especially when I was making that transition over to a DAW, when I was still getting comfortable, just with my own composing workflow. And I realized that one of the very first mistakes I made was that I wasn't performing the lines, I was just programming notes. I was taking the MIDI and just transferring it over. So at the time, if I were to write out a melody in Sibelius, I would include different articulation markings. I would include dynamic markings, crescendos, decrescendos, but it didn't translate well once I was in the DAW. I kind of assumed that if I had good samples, it would kind of just naturally flow. And that was not the case. And thinking back now, it's because I didn't have a really good understanding of modulation, expression, vibrato. I didn't really understand the tools at my disposal to actually humanize the performance. So, for example, I knew that modulation kind of affected the timbre of the instrument, it really kind of affecting like the dynamics, but I didn't really have a grasp on expression. When I first started out, I thought that expression was volume. I would see people say, oh, expression is basically volume. And at the time, I'm like, well, we have a volume fader and we have an expression fader, which is also volume. So I couldn't really understand the difference between the two. So I kept expression at 127. So basically 100%. That made my music sound so unnatural. It made my music have really aggressive entrances and exits just because I thought that modulation was taking care of the natural flow of the performance, but I didn't realize that expression can help ease that performance as well. So once I started using modulation, expression, and the sample libraries that have a vibrato fader all together, I was able to create something that feels like it's breathing. Now, of course, nothing really beats a live player, but this made a really dramatic difference from what I was doing before to the way I was writing now. Now, the way that these faders work are probably going to be dependent on the library that you have. Some might not have a vibrato fader, some might have a specific dedicated articulation for vibrato. Some libraries might have a certain amount of crossfades. So when you take a recording of like a piano performance, crossfade it to mezzo piano, crossfade it to mezzo forte. That might vary depending on what you're using, but in general, you want to take advantage of those faders. And if you've seen other videos, normally I have my iPad set up as basically my MIDI controller, and I have those three faders real big, ready to go: modulation, expression, and vibrato. So once I got the performance itself under my belt, the next mistake I realized was that I didn't understand the space, the balance, and depth of my music. And a lot of times this led to mixing issues down the road. More often than not, when I would take the music and go do the car test, it felt very cluttered, it felt very muddy. Again, my brain was very focused on this Sibelius style of writing where I just am writing for an instrument. I'm not really thinking about where this instrument is. And so, my first thought was, well, let me add some reverb. I know a lot of composers use reverb, so let me just throw a ton on. And that really washed out the sound. That is also what contributed to just a very muddy, unclear sound. Other times, a lot of the music felt too centered. When I would do research, look up tutorials and stuff, people are like, oh, well, make sure you spread out your ensemble or just the orchestra as a whole. And I thought that just meant to use like a stereo spread. And that then made everything sound too stereo, too separated, and not like the orchestra, the ensemble I was writing for was in the same room. Now, I don't think as a composer, you then have to become a perfect mix engineer. I think that, one, there are mix engineers out there who you can pass your music on to, but I understand that money is a factor for a lot of us. I understand that you want your music to sound good and you want to be able to get there. So just having a basic understanding of how the space works for your sample libraries, I think that will really work wonders for you. So for example, a lot of libraries will offer some sort of full or main mix or something along those lines. And this is just like a default, already balanced mix fader that you can use. I honestly think that that is a fantastic starting point, but then a lot of the time you'll see different mic positions for your spot mics, your close mics, your tree, your overhead tree mics, your ambient, your outriggers. And so looking back, what I didn't realize was that if I messed with the mic positions too much and I didn't know what I was doing, I would often make the sound of the instrument worse. I remember Steve, who used to work at Cinesamples, I remember he said once that like, yeah, the mic positions are there for you if you need them, but like Dennis Sands mixed that main full mix signal. If it's good enough for Dennis Sands, it's good enough for him, and I feel pretty much the same way. Unless there's an issue where the instrument sounds too far back in the mix, then okay, let me see what I can do to bring it forward. Next, I had to actually think about where each instrument was from left to right? Where in the stereo field were the sections? So that really affected how I wanted to pan the instruments. A lot of sample libraries already come pre-panned, which is great, you know? You're not getting the signal directly down the middle. That's why it's really important to just know the layout of an orchestra, or the ensemble that you're working with, because it's going to sound more realistic. It's going to actually sound like the different sections are coming from different areas in front of you. And by doing this, you're also just carving out subtly a little bit of space. And not only did I had to think in terms of left to right, but I also had to think front to back. And this is of course where mic positions really do come into play, because if I'm working with multiple libraries from different developers, then, you know, they're obviously not going to be all recorded in the same space. The setup is not going to be the same. So at that point, I do want to at least just find a balance where everything still sounds cohesive and as if it's in the same room. And the thing is, when I was just working with notation and just using Sibelius, it didn't even cross my mind to think spatially. But once I really started focusing on my mock-ups and the quality of the music, I not only had to think like a composer and an orchestrator, I then had to put on my mix engineer hat, you know, and really think about distance and blend and how I could sculpt out space for each section of the ensemble. And I think one of my biggest mistakes that I made was an over-reliance on sample libraries. This is kind of a weird one because it almost is me wanting to go back to Sibelius or just notation writing. So let me explain what I mean. Sample libraries give you access to everything, right? Of course, depending on the library, depending on how much you spend and whatever is packaged in the library itself. But it almost made me forget some of the foundational knowledge that I had when I was learning about composition and learning about the orchestra. A lot of times I would forget about the size of the orchestra that I was writing for. I would forget what realistically an orchestra can do. When it came to wanting to write divisi or splitting out parts, you know, it's easy on a keyboard to just hit two notes and then you get the two notes that you want. But when you're working with samples, you are essentially doubling the size of your section of that ensemble. Whereas if you're actually writing and saying, I want this to be played divisis in the strings, then you're supposed to get a thinner sound because you're actually splitting that one section into two. So slowly I had to start thinking about how would I treat this virtual orchestra like a real one. For example, some libraries like from Spitfire, they might come with dedicated strings A and strings B. They'll tell you how many strings are in this patch. And then, you know, if it's 16 for full strings like violin, then okay, A and B might be 8 and 8. So in a way, the more I overly relied on my samples, the less of a realistic mock-up I was creating, because I just wasn't intentionally thinking about the performance of a live orchestra. And that really led to a loss in clarity throughout the entire process, because I wasn't thinking about range. I was unintentionally doubling melodic lines. I wasn't really thinking about harmony. So a lot of times you might hear clashes in the notes. I wasn't splitting out the parts for players correctly. So, you know, for strings, I wasn't thinking divisi. Instead, I was just stacking the samples. And this all led to a very blurry, unclear product as a mock-up. And it's ironic because the more tools I had, the more professional sounding samples that I had, the less I was actually getting what I wanted from my music. This isn't to say that this was a problem because of the sample library or because of the DAW. This was completely on me just not being aware that I was even making this mistake. You know, once I took a step back and was like, why is my music sounding this way? Still, I'm using great libraries. I'm working in a digital audio workstation. In a way, I had to go back to the fundamentals. I had to go back to the roots that I started with. I really had to think, how can I still write as if this was a real orchestra? And once I was able to, you know, read the piano roll editor correctly and view it almost in the way I would view like a full orchestral layout, I was able to see, okay, you know what? Harmonically, things don't make sense in the piano roll. All right, let me go ahead and change that. You know what? This range is way too high for this instrument. Let me readjust and maybe pass that along to another instrument. Once I got comfortable writing for a DAW, the same way I was comfortable writing in Sibelius, then I started noticing the clarity in my music again. I started realizing that it's not just the samples that help with the music, but it's also the arrangement and just knowing how to write for individual parts, not just an ensemble patch. And I really think that the number one technique or practice that helped my mock-ups by far was recreating my favorite soundtracks and scores. At first, I was really reliant on full scores. So, you know, John Powell has his How to Train Your Dragon book, the full thing. I also have like John Williams, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone score, and I felt the need to look at exactly what was happening, and that was fantastic. That was great for analysis. That was great to just get a sense of what was going on through that composer's mind. But what really helped me was listening, critically listening to a score, put headphones on so you could really hear the space of the ensemble, where everything falls. It really got me thinking about depth and how far back percussion actually was. And what I really like about recreating these scores is, in a way, a lot of the problem solving is on me, because if I don't have the full score in front of me to tell me exactly what's going on, I have to really listen. Like, what is that run that the woodwinds are doing, you know? And if I can't figure out exactly what's going on, then how can I use my knowledge of the orchestra? How can I use my knowledge of harmony to try and get as close as possible to that? It really is a lot more work, but it also opened up my ear a little bit more. It made me more conscious of the blend between sections in the orchestra. And whenever someone tells me that they just don't know how to write for a full orchestra, they've never done it before, or whenever they try, it just doesn't sound real, the number one thing you could do is just recreate scores. Listen to what your favorite composers are doing and apply those concepts to your own music too. Because when I look back and I listen to all, you know, my old music before I really took any of it seriously, or when I was just starting out and learning and growing in the process, it's hard to listen to. But I also see the progress that I've made. You might have the very best sample libraries, the most expensive ones, the ones that the pros are using, but if you're not thinking about the performance, if you're not thinking about the space of the ensemble, if you're not thinking about how to actually write for an ensemble, then your mockups are still gonna sound unrealistic. And if you feel like you're struggling with idea development or your mockups or even website design and just like general composer outreach, I want you to know that I'm available for one-to-one strategy sessions. I also have my Composer Odyssey membership that is brand new. It is a space for you to submit your work to me, get feedback, in-depth detail about your music, about your website, and hopefully make you feel more confident and see that progress that you're making as a composer. So if you are interested, I'll leave links in the description down below. But until then, let me know in a comment, what is the hardest stage that you're at right now? What are you struggling with the most? Because I would love to know how I can help you even further. So I'll see you in the next video, and as always, happy composing.